Now, I'm guessing many of you know Prom Night, the 1980s slasher classic. Pretty expected plot. As kids, a bunch of kids, it's sort of like a I know what you did last summer type thing. They accidentally cast the death of another kid. Then we flash forward. I think it's like, I don't know, 6, 7 years, 8 years, 10 years, something like that. And then they're in high school, and then over the course of the movie, people are mysteriously dying as revenge for the death or potential death of this one kid many years ago. And throughout the course of the movie, we have some main characters who are trying to sort of figure out what's going on. Well, actually, I'm not sure if anybody knows anybody's really dying until toward the end of the movie. A lot of it's just sort of high school drama, getting ready for the prom type thing, which you can probably expect from a movie called Prom Night. It's a decent, it's a decent slasher for the time. There's some decent kills, there's a decent decapitation. My personal opinion, the movie isn't quite as mesmerizing as other slashers around the same time. You know, even though Jamie Lee Curtis is decent in this movie, she was, of course, better in Halloween. Same year Prom Night came out, there was a movie named Terror Chain, which I personally thought was a much better, more suspenseful slasher. And there's other slashers around the same time, such as My Bloody Valentine, that have a lot more, in my opinion, kick than Prom Night. Overall, I would say Prom Night's decent, but when it comes to all the 80s slashes, Prom Night's not usually the movie I find myself watching. I have seen it about 4 or 5 times and I appreciate it, but it's not one of my personal favorites.
Yeah. Prom Night's a movie that I never really watched when I was young. I definitely heard about it. I guess I never managed to see it at the video store at the right time. So I've only ever seen it a few times, and I think the first time I saw it was probably in my early 20s. And it's a movie that I actually rather enjoy. As I do, I enjoy a lot of slasher movies. Because of the time period it's set in, a lot of the music and fashion is reminiscent of time that I can remember, at least from when I was much younger. And I think for me, another reason why I don't know if this is a reason why I enjoy it, or it's just a convenient thing to say, but my high school prom really sucked. So, anytime I can see someone else have a bad time at a prom or something go crazy at a prom, I gotta really get a kick out of it. I don't think the actual slasher scenes themselves, outside of that one decapitation that you mentioned, there's not a whole lot to it. I mean, there's a bit of running around there towards the end. The majority of the movie, though, there's not really any chase scenes or anything.
Yeah, it's a pretty slow beginning, in my opinion.
I mean, they're really building up to what's going to happen on prom night, but you're not really seeing all these people like a traditional slasher movie, where every 10-20 minutes someone's getting chased and killed. For this one, most of that happens towards the end of the movie. So maybe, I don't know, for you, maybe for you that's a part of the reason why it doesn't work as well as some of the others.
I also feel like once we find out the identity of the killer near the end of the movie, it didn't entirely jive with me. I just felt like the killer, who was the character we of course had been introduced to before, I feel like people would have noticed this character gone during the time the murders took place. And it's easy to say, oh, he just disappeared and he ends up being the killer, but it didn't feel right to me. Now, on a related note, I actually thought the ending was probably one of my favorite parts of the movie. It's a very emotional scene, which is quite unlike many slashes. It's helped along by, in my opinion, a pretty decently depressing song titled Fade to Black, and the movie ends on a rather depressive note, emotional note, that a lot of times sort of seem out of place in a slasher movie. So I will give it credit for that. It's a sort of unique feel. No, and of course there are a few characters in the movie who are enjoyable. I mean, who doesn't like seeing Jamie Lee Curtis? And I'm not sure which actor played him, but the guy who played Slick. I mean, Slick was a pretty fun character anytime he was on screen. Though I cannot believe for a second that guy was in high school. I know. My biggest issue with the movie is it takes a decent time to get going, and once it really gets going, it's not like some explosive finale. The decapitation is, in my opinion, pretty much the only really noteworthy scene aside from the conclusion in the movie. There's some decent music, there's some a Jamie Lee Curtis dance disco scene. You can't go wrong there. But I feel like many people come into this not necessarily to see a disco themed prom night, but probably for the slasher aspects, and it's a bit lacking until like the last 25 minutes maybe. And also related, there's not a whole lot of either gore or nudity in the movie, so that's sort of another staple of slashers that this doesn't have a whole lot of, which may or may not turn some people away.
I definitely agree with the ending. I have the same thoughts about how it ends and with the song that plays afterwards. For specific scenes of movies, I'll go back and just rewatch those scenes on YouTube or wherever. And that's one of those scenes, that ending, that I do revisit quite a lot. And that decapitation scene that you're talking about, that was quite good, and it couldn't have happened to a nicer person. Because that guy was a total douchebag. It's got that disco music playing, which was a big thing around that time.
Yeah, it's worth noting to anybody listening. And I mentioned this in the previous episode, I was born in the early 90s, so this type of thing I entirely skipped over. Now, that said, I do occasionally enjoy disco, but at the same time, coming from a kid who was born in the 90s and someone who didn't even go to his prom, it didn't even suck, I just didn't go. There's a lot in this movie that not necessarily related to me and my high school experience, which is okay because it's interesting seeing sort of a time capsule, but at the same time it sometimes lacks the emotion that you might otherwise expect or hope for.
Yeah. Well, just earlier when you were mentioning who's the killer in this movie, and you mentioned, he's kind of missing towards the end, I think there's actually quite a few different suspects that you could really say that about. I think Leslie Nielsen's character just randomly disappears after he has that dance with his daughter, and you never really see him again in the movie at all, and he's still got the same motive, and we know he was the last person holding that mask that the killer uses.
There's one thing that I did neglect to mention. I do think the movie does a decent job. It's not great. I think it does a decent job though of throwing us potentially new suspects. And if you can keep track of the characters, which I will admit for the longest time was my biggest issue with the movie, just keeping track of who was who and who was dating, who was going with each other to the prom. If you can keep track of characters, I think the ending is a decent surprise. Might not necessarily be what you expect because it's pretty much not anything leading up to it. So I do think the movie did a decent job at throwing us different potential suspects.
Yeah. I think also now that, we've got all these decades worth of movies, we've kind of conditioned ourselves to know what to look for in a surprise reveal. So this particular movie, I believe, had at least 4 different people that you could look at and say, it could be that person. Like, they've got this escaped lunatic on the loose. They've also got this weirdo that works at the school, this weirdo handyman that they've got.
It seems like every high school back in the 80s had one of those.
Yeah, but, then the high school principal and his son, so at least those 4 alone, you can make a case for, could it be them?
It just hit me on an unrelated note to that. Another scene that I actually really enjoyed. There was a death sequence that took place with a couple making out in a van, and that led to an okay chase sequence in sort of a van rolling off a hillside.
I'm fairly certain that this movie has, like, the longest chase scene in movie history, I believe. Or maybe that's been passed since. I guess that's just something noteworthy to mention. And all the action does kind of happen in that last 20-25 minutes of the movie, so you don't really notice it dragging on.
Yeah, you just noticed it dragging before.
Well, it didn't really drag that much for me, personally. I was kind of enjoying the build-up as to what's going to happen. You still get all the creepy phone calls and this plan that this one girl has to ruin prom night for Jamie Lee Curtis's character, or her date, or whatever they were going to do there at the end. I still enjoyed the characters, even though some of them were stupid, and maybe 1 or 2 of them were annoying.
Were you a fan of Slick by any chance?
Yeah, well, he was slick, wasn't he?
Very handsome guy.
His date, I mean, she seemed like quite a fun lady. So
I always enjoyed that scene in that movie because it's just some creepy guy in the van picking up this woman. And it turns out to be probably one of the best relationships in the movie.
it's pretty weird because when you do see them at the start, yeah, he's got that kind of creepy vibe, like he's got free candy plastered on the side of his van, or at least that's what he should have on there. And, he just comes along, spouts out a few cheeseball pickup lines.
And it works.
and it works. She just gets in, like, just take me straight to school. Yeah, no problem.
And my favorite thing about this, she actually, from everything I remember, she seemed pretty happy with him as a date. So it's nice to see.
Yeah, it worked out well up until what actually happens.
What did you think about the beginning of the movie?
I don't really have too many thoughts one way or the other about it.
I'll simply say that children are probably a bunch of dicks and they are often annoying. So
that is kind of what you did back for fun 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago, just playing around like that in dangerous places. And I remember, where I grew up on this big farm, and we had a lot of these sheds that are quite dilapidated, and I've had nails go through my feet and all kinds of things, just from playing around in dangerous areas. So I kind of understand the silly games they're trying to play there. But one other thing, with that early scene, I just wanted to also mention that not for all the kids, but for the two kids playing, I believe it was Jamie Lee Curtis's character and her brother, I thought they actually looked quite a lot like their adult counterparts.
Yeah, I thought they did as decent as you can expect, a pretty decent job with getting somewhat similar faces.
Yeah, because some movies, they just do a terrible job in it.
Yeah, so overall, I think Prom Night is a decent slasher. If you're a slasher fan, you'll probably be moderately happy. It's even for the time period, it's just a little derivative, but it's still an generally enjoyable movie. I personally think the beginning drags out a bit, and the high school drama, as much as I enjoy Jamie Lee Curtis, it doesn't do that much for me. That said, there are worse movies that deal with high school drama, such as the movie we'll be discussing shortly. Prom Night is a classic slasher, but it's not one of those movies I often go back to. I've seen it, like I said, about 4 to 5 times, and I've never really loved it. I've appreciated it. I really enjoy the poster. If you have seen it, really drags you in to the movie. But overall, I usually see this about a 6.5, at best a 7, but usually I'd rate it around a 6.5 out of 10.
For me, it's a movie that I enjoy revisiting every now and then. I don't think the slasher aspect of it is what really makes it enjoyable for me, even though those parts are nice and it does have one or two decent kills. The ending is probably what takes it over the top for me. I don't really cry at movies, but, kind of tears at your heartstrings a little. I give the movie a score of 8 out of 10. I actually quite enjoy it.
And worth mentioning, if you have not heard the song at the ending credits, like I said, it's titled Fade to Black by a lady named Godine Simpson. I believe you can probably find it on YouTube, but it's definitely a great song, and even though I didn't love the movie, the song itself is pretty much worth a listen.